Who's talking at me? Oh, damn, bloody scam calls. Thank you for calling Tony's Mortuary and Pizzeria, where yesterday's loss is today's sauce. How may I help you? Got him. Well, I've got a full load for you today. Unlike a few recent months, I actually got quite a bit of reading done in June 2025, and so now it's time for my monthly book review video. In case you're new to this channel, this is something we do every month, wherein I review all the books I read over the previous month. It's usually fairly horror-centric, which makes sense because this is, of course, a horror channel, but I always sneak in a few other kinds of books too, and this month is, of course, no exception. In fact, there's quite an eclectic mix this month. If any of you happen to find any of these books interesting, I've put purchase links right down there in the What's It for you, and using those is a great way to get some books for yourself while also supporting my channel. Speaking of which, if you do like what I do here, be sure to subscribe, click the thumbs up, and tell a friend. All of those things are a great help to me. But without further ado, I really do have quite a few books to get through this month, so let's get right to it. We're going to start off with one that's non-fiction rather than a horror novel, but still ought to be of interest to horror fans for multiple reasons. And the book in question is Murder at the Brown Palace by Dick Kreck. The Brown Palace, mentioned in the title of this book, in case any potential readers might not know, is a famous hotel in Denver, sort of a Denver landmark in many ways. As such, this true crime story that took place there is probably of greatest interest to Denver residents or those with some connection to the Brown Palace itself. But I'm here to tell you that the story detailed in this book ought to be of interest to readers anywhere and everywhere, because it describes a love triangle, or perhaps more accurately, a love quadrilateral, that ended with a double homicide right in the hotel's lounge at the Brown Palace. And it was quite the murder indeed, though true crime aficionados will probably find it less sensational than many of the other things they read about. Indeed, the murder itself takes place and is almost fully described in the very early part, in the opening pages of the book, leaving the rest of the book to detailed backstories of the various players involved and the legal battles following the crime. As such, whether this is the book for you largely depends on your purpose for it. If you're looking for a historical account, this book is excellent. Few stones are left unturned, and you'll come away with a complete account of the entire affair, including brief biographies of all of the major players involved. But if you're looking for the kind of true crime story that reads like a horror or a thriller novel, you might find this one a tad too academic in its approach. Which is not to say that the writing is dry. It's not. It's well written. But rather I mean only that the author has chosen not to omit many, if any, of the details he uncovered. He really wanted to present the whole story in a sort of detailed historic account, and that's exactly what he did. All that said, the author is to be credited for impeccable research. Though the crime occurred more than a century ago, the author was able to track down sufficient information to really bring all of the characters to life and to make the story seem as relevant as if it happened only yesterday instead of more than 100 years in the past. I should also mention that my own reason for reading this book this month is that I'm well on my way into writing the third volume of my Case Files of the Rocky Mountain Paranormal Research Society series of books. It'll be coming out this fall, so stay tuned for that. But one of the cases we investigated, and which will be featured in that third volume, was indeed the Brown Palace. So this was some background research for me, in addition to just being an interesting book. So if you're looking for connections between this book and the horror genre beyond just it being a story of a murder, that might be just the excuse that you're looking for. Next up also isn't exactly horror, but it's a sort of collection of tales, and some of the stories I think would count as horror. I'm speaking of the Arabian Nights, or the 1001 Nights, or the 1000 Nights and a Night, depending on who's translated the title. The edition I read is called the Arabian Nights, so that's what I'm going to call it for now, although the 1001 Nights is more accurate. Obviously, this is a classic work, and a work in translation, so it's difficult to review as I normally would. I can't just review it in the same way that I would many of these other ones. In case anyone might not be familiar, this is a collection of often fantastic stories, and they're nested within a frame story, in which Scheherazade tells all of these stories for 1001 nights to keep her jealous husband, the Sultan, amused, and therefore to preserve her own life. It's one of those collections of tales that, even if you've never read it, you've undoubtedly seen other works directly inspired by it. So we can't underestimate its importance to the history and development of literature. But it's also difficult because whether you like it or not probably depends in part on what translation you get. I can review this translation, but if you apply that to another translation, my thoughts may or may not apply. In fact, many different translations even include different selections of stories, and there's sort of a weird history in terms of which translations include what, and who added what, and who took out what, and all of those kinds of things. This one that I read is the one from the Barnes & Noble Classics line of books. And it's far from the most complete version. Indeed, a truly complete version would be many thousands of pages long. This is, though, a good curated selection of the work, and still fairly hefty at over 700 pages, but it's not the complete work, if that's what you're looking for. I suspect most readers probably aren't really looking for the full thing, though. They just want to get a taste of it and get sort of the most important bits of it. And so this might be among the most accessible of versions. Regardless of which version you might choose to read, though, it's one of those that I think everyone ought to at least read some of, because so much of subsequent literature, and for that matter, subsequent theater and film and culture in general, has been inspired by it. This is one of those really important books that you ought to be familiar with. My next book is the least related to the horror genre of all of our books so far this month, and that's The Ancestor's Tale by Richard Dawkins. The premise of this book is that of a pilgrimage of sorts, explicitly modeled on Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. But in this case, instead of various human pilgrims, our cast of characters include all the species of the world. And instead of traveling through space to Canterbury, they're traveling through time toward the common ancestor of all the species. In that way, Dawkins seeks to present a complete, in scare quotes, history of all life in reverse order, albeit with all the disclaimers and caveats appropriate to attempting a complete evolutionary history of life in any single volume work. This is a large book, but not large enough to include a truly complete history. It's a complete overview of the history, let's say. Like its Chaucerian inspiration, at each rendezvous with a new group of pilgrims, one such pilgrim, in this case a species, gets to tell a tale. In the context of this book, those tales are the stories of how certain species or traits have evolved, and of how scientists have come to understand them. One of the great features of the book is that each chapter begins with an illustrated tree of life, as you see here, showing the relationships between quote-unquote new species joining the pilgrimage, and all the other species already rejoined with their cousins on their ancestry toward the common ancestor on this sort of pilgrim's journey. In that way, if one flips through, reading only the first pages of the chapters, one can immediately get a sort of bird's eye view of the interrelatedness of all the major groups of species. Obviously, not every species can be individually represented. There are too many millions of them. But it does, nevertheless, provide a good intuitive understanding of who is more closely or distantly related to whom. The tales themselves are written in Dawkins' usual style, scientifically detailed but not so filled with jargon as to be inaccessible to lay readers, and that's one of the things that I have a lot of respect for Richard Dawkins for. He presents the real science, not a dumbed down version, but the real thing, but in a way that any reasonably intelligent person can understand. If one were to criticize anything in an otherwise wonderful book, it might be that sometimes Dawkins can't help but occasionally insert his opinions on non-scientific topics. Often, that's not only understandable, but even adds to the book's quality. For instance, somewhere in the middle of the book, he offers a touching tribute to the late great Douglas Adams, author of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy books, who had been a good friend of the author. But on occasion, he does commit the sin of assuming his readers share his philosophy on non-scientific topics, and risks distracting from his larger and more important message. Fortunately, these are fairly rare digressions, though, and the reader is quickly back on track with learning everything one can about our evolutionary ancestors and cousins. One thing for which the book deserves a lot of credit: it does a great job of fostering a feeling of connection with other species. Predominantly animal, although the book does go far enough back to discuss our connection to fungi, plants, and bacteria. It is, therefore, highly recommended. But of course, that's 3 books not in our favorite genre, however tangentially related to horror some of them might be. So now it's time to get to a proper horror novel. The first of those I have lined up for you is this Danforth, Eldritch Tales of World War II, Volume 1, Tomb of the Black Pharaoh by Christopher Michael. I was really excited to dive into this one because I'm a fan of Lovecraftian fiction and of historical fiction, and the World War II era is of particular interest to me, as it is, I think, to many of us. That war was such a calamity that one almost feels like there has to be some kind of Lovecraftian monstrosity at the heart of it all. And while that may not be historically valid, it is an interesting premise for a horror novel, and that's exactly what this Danforth book delivers. Before I read it, I wasn't sure exactly how much would be borrowed directly from Lovecraft's mythos, and how much would just have a sort of Lovecraftian flavor while being an otherwise original story. Well, the reality is a bit of both, but with much greater emphasis on the former. Even the main character of the book, Danforth, was lifted directly from Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness. He was a graduate student in that work, and is now, in this work, a much older and wiser individual sent to Egypt during the war to investigate various occult mysteries surrounding the war effort. I won't spoil too much about exactly who or what is involved, or what exactly they're all doing, but it's probably no great secret to dyed-in-the-wool Lovecraft fans that the Black Pharaoh of the book's title is the same one mentioned in Lovecraft's own works. Other events and characters are likewise borrowed both from Lovecraft and genuine actual true history, but the book doesn't just rip anyone or anything off. Think of it as a sort of sequel or alternate history, entirely original but with numerous references to established lore. The writing style is going to be a mixed bag for many readers. Personally, I liked it a lot, but I think a lot of modern readers might find some of it a bit slow, or maybe even something of a slog to get through. There's some truth to that. I'm going to understand if somebody makes that argument. But the reason I think that's actually a good thing is because it genuinely feels a lot like one of Lovecraft's own stories, and combined with some elements of historical memoir which don't always have the same pacing as a novel. So both in terms of its literary ancestry or lineage and in terms of its subject matter, the style makes sense. The author seems to have made a conscious decision to write it in an appropriate style for the subject matter. So it is a slower read than a lot of people in the sort of social media generation might be accustomed to. But as was always the case in Lovecraft's own works, the reader is rewarded by the end of the story. I was a little thrown off by the lack of any page numbers in my hardcover edition of the book. I don't know whether the same is true of any other editions. But while that won't affect my review overall, just as it didn't really affect my enjoyment of the novel, it does make it a bit difficult to refer back to specific pages or passages. For instance, if one might want to compare the book's references to Lovecraft's original writings, or some of the historic characters, or something like that. Overall, though, while it was a slower read than expected, and not quite as action-packed as one might expect a World War II horror novel to be, it does pay off with several knuckle-whitening scenes throughout, and an excellent homage to Lovecraft's great mythos, so I'd give it a read, especially if you're a fan of the father of cosmic horror. Next up, while another non-horror title does continue a trend in my reading of late and in these review videos over the past few months, with another Jeeves book. In this case, I read The Code of the Woosters by P.G. Wodehouse. As I've said in those previous videos when I've reviewed other Jeeves books, you really can't go wrong with P.G. Wodehouse. He was one of the great and undeniable masters of humorous prose, treating us to laugh out loud, and I do mean genuinely laugh out loud funny stories that, though written in book form and in prose, are quite reminiscent of theatrical farces. You would not think these stories were out of place on the comic stage. This Code of the Woosters is certainly no exception to that. Rather than being a collection of loosely related short stories, as many of the Jeeves books are, and as the ones that I've reviewed over the past couple of months have been, this is a complete standalone novel, and I think devoting the entire length of a book to a single story, albeit one with plenty of tangents and side plots and digressions, is one of the reasons why this is widely considered one of the greatest of the Jeeves books in the entire series. I'm inclined to agree with that assessment. And of course, since I've been reviewing these Jeeves books for a couple of months now, I'd be remiss if I didn't also recommend, in passing, the television series Jeeves and Wooster, which adapted the stories to the screen. While the books are always and invariably better than the film versions, Stephen Fry and Hugh Laurie, as Jeeves and Wooster respectively, come damn close, and this would make a great follow-up to the original Wodehouse books. So I recommend this as well. But moving on to the next one, I have another one that I'll probably want more just to mention and to talk about than to really review, and that was this Selected Letters of Abigail and John Adams. During their lives, often absent from one another for long durations, John Adams, our founding father and second president, and his wife Abigail exchanged more than 1,000 letters, many of which were lovingly preserved, first by the couple themselves, and then by their family, and eventually by historians. Because these were never meant for public consumption, an ordinary book review is out of the question. But because their letters are often so beautiful and heartfelt, not to mention providing a unique glimpse into the minds of a couple of history's most important and accomplished figures, all one can really say is read this book. Now, obviously, this short little book does not contain all of the letters in question. It's a collection of 81 of their letters posted between March 1776 and March of 1777, meaning these letters capture the very moment of American independence. It's a small piece of history, but it's well worth reading, both for the quality of the letters themselves, and as I say, they're beautiful and frankly make me wish more people still wrote in such a manner today, and also for providing the personal context often absent from the way history books describe such important figures as John and Abigail Adams. I read this one, this month anyway, almost in passing. I'd been tidying up my study and I happened across this copy I bought on a whim while visiting a local bookstore on other business, and I'm almost ashamed to admit I had honestly forgotten briefly that I'd purchased it. But when I saw it sitting there on the shelf, I thought I would just read a couple pages before getting back to work. Instead, I sat down and read the whole thing in one sitting. I guess either I'm a hell of a history nerd or it's really just that good. Probably a bit of both. But regardless, even though I had read many of John and Abigail Adams' letters before, it was delightful to reread some of them and to read a few of them for the first time in this collection. This is the Dover Thrift Editions version, and you can pick this up for just a couple dollars. These Dover Thrift Editions are a great way to get classic literature on the cheap. Next up is actually a pair of books published together, or you could call it a book in 2 volumes or something like that. It's called The Great Illusions of Magic by Byron G. Wells. The first book, this hardcover, contains the written descriptions, and this paperback second volume contains the relevant blueprints. Just so I'm not juggling both of them, I'm going to put this one down. I'll just hold this one up for now. This book really does describe, as the title suggests, some of the great illusions of magic. We're talking, in magic, when we talk about illusions, it's a little bit different from common parlance. To many people, an illusion is any magic trick, but to a magician, illusions are the grand stage productions, the things with big boxes and cutting people in half and disappearing out of boxes or appearing in boxes, those kinds of things. That's what we're talking about when we talk about illusions in the magic world. This one is written for magicians. This is not for lay audiences or general audience. This is for magicians. And this isn't really a history of the art or much of a description of what the illusions look like or anything like that, although it does cover quite a bit of the history of Grand Illusion through talking about the illusions themselves, and the basic appearance of them is described. But what this really is, rather, is a work for magicians or illusion builders to use in the construction and performance of these illusions. This is basically a how-to book. And on that, it's sort of a mixed bag. It really is, honestly, one of the finest collections of illusions I've ever seen, and I have read quite a few of them. Setting aside some modern proprietary designs, this is almost encyclopedic in its coverage of the genre. If there's an illusion you're looking for, as long as it's not a recent invention, there's a really good chance it's in this book. And if you're looking to build or perform any of these illusions, the book technically does contain everything you need to know in order to make it happen. However, therein, as the bard would tell us, lies the rub, because it's not written or illustrated in a particularly user-friendly manner. The descriptions are brief, and the illustrations are limited to an artistic illustration at the beginning of each description, which helps the reader to understand what the illusion looks like, but not how it's built or how it's performed, and then a single, highly detailed blueprint for each construction in this second volume, often reconstructed from aged documents. As such, neither builders nor performers really ever get a step-by-step instruction for how these illusions are built or performed. The information is there, but you'll have to spend some hours rereading the descriptions over and over again and staring at these blueprints, often with magnifying glass in hand, before you really begin to understand what's really going on. So, if you're looking at this for historical research, it's a godsend. This is one of the best collections of illusions I've ever come across. But, on the other hand, if you're looking for a user-friendly tutorial geared toward actually building and performing these, there are better resources available, even if you probably won't find all of them in a single edition anywhere else. You'll have to get one illusion in this book, another illusion in this book, and so forth. The connection to horror here is a subtle one, especially since most people, as non-magicians, won't have much interest in the book anyway. But for me, the connection, and there is a connection to horror for somebody like me, is that many of these illusions, done properly, really are the stuff of horror. Imagine the now cliched cutting a woman in half trick. It seems hokey to us now because it's been done to death, but in its day, audiences were treated to the sight of what they couldn't easily distinguish from an actual murder taking place on the stage. Yes, they knew it was just a show. Audiences weren't stupid back in the day, but they'd never seen anything like that before, and it looked real, and the magicians back in the day didn't play it for laughs. They played it for real. And, there were audience members fainting and that sort of thing. So these, not all of these, but many of these were really meant to be terrifying. And that's the kind of magic I'm most interested in. And that's what this book could deliver if the reader were willing to actually decode its contents. The next book on our list is also technically not a horror novel, but good lord is it scary. It's called The Anxious Generation: How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness by Jonathan Haidt. I previously read this author's earlier book, The Coddling of the American Mind, and found it an insightful, if often unsettling, look at how younger generations seem to be mentally and emotionally diverging, not only from their parents' and grandparents' generations, but arguably from every human generation in recorded history. It's well worth a read if you haven't read it yet, and it was the reason, or one of the reasons, I was excited to pick up this book, which can be seen as something of a follow-up on a slightly different but highly related subject. The basic question of this book is, why are so many young people mentally ill? Both formal diagnoses and self-reports of anxiety and depression and a whole slew of other mental illnesses are indeed skyrocketing in the last several years, especially but not exclusively among young people. In this book, Haidt suggests that our modern society has arranged things in such a way that we've sort of redefined the characteristics of childhood, and thus largely rewired the brains of our children. In particular, the author calls out social media, although not exclusively social media, for redesigning how children interact with the world, often during sensitive periods in physical and mental development, and in such a way that critical aspects of both psychological and neurological development are altered. Dozens of different mechanisms are described in this book in horrifying detail, but it's not just social media. He also suggests that the loss of free play plays a similarly important role. Paraphrasing something he wrote in the book, his argument, basically, is that parents have become too restrictive of their children's movements in the real world, the so-called helicopter parents that won't even let their children sit alone for 5 minutes, that sort of thing, but at the same time have become too lenient in the online space. Many parents have no idea what their children are doing on social media. Readers can quibble over some of the author's prescriptions to solve the problem. I certainly don't agree with all of them myself. But even the author himself points out that these are suggestions, and they're a sort of first crack at solving a difficult problem, and not all of them are likely to be the right thing to do. They're the best he could come up with at the time, that sort of thing. Even if we may not like all of his prescriptive suggestions, though, I think we can applaud his descriptive work in sounding the alarm bell concerning a topic that I think might be of existential significance for our society. So yeah, maybe not a horror novel, not a novel at all, it's nonfiction, but certainly just about the most horrifying book I read this month. Next, I moved on to another follow-up to a book I read a couple months ago. Back then, I read Dennis Prager's commentary on the book of Genesis. So this month, I read his commentary, part of his Rational Bible series, on Exodus. The Exodus is probably the most important story in Judaism, and certainly among the most important stories in Christianity and literature broadly. But while Prager explicitly says that he's trying to write for audiences of all faiths or none, his perspective is certainly a Jewish one. Prager's argument, or at least one of his arguments, is that though the Torah, or the Bible at large, the Torah means the first 5 books, his argument is that though the Torah was written for specific people at a specific point in history, its relevance has not faded in modernity. Therefore, much of his commentary is aimed at translating certain verses in such a way as to render them comprehensible to modern ears, or to applying the teachings of Exodus to modern situations. In those goals, he succeeds admirably. Obviously, readers will come at this book from a variety of perspectives. There are passages, for example, that atheists will struggle to understand, even despite Prager's best attempts to explain, or these readers might argue he's trying to explain away some of the difficult passages. Christians will notice a lack of commentary pointing toward what they believe are foreshadowings of the New Testament, and though Prager's Jewish commentary will feel most comfortable probably to the Jewish people, different movements within Judaism might agree or disagree on a variety of his points. So I don't think anyone, except Dennis Prager himself and people who are very closely related to his philosophical outlook, are going to agree with 100% of this stuff. But it's valuable to get this perspective and to understand the commentary, and even if you don't agree with all of his arguments, to at least sort of understand where he's coming from. But where the book really shines, despite not quite succeeding in being all things to all people, as if it never could be, where it really shines is in rendering the text more approachable to modern readers. I've read Exodus before. I've read the entire Bible several times, but even though the story is quite familiar to me, Prager nevertheless provided countless new insights that helped me both to understand the wisdom contained in the ancient text, and why it's considered such a central element in Jewish culture. Long-ish essays explain, for example, the 10 Commandments in great detail, and I think are a real highlight of this volume. Going back to the original Hebrew as necessary, Prager explains why he thinks those 10 laws are so foundational to morality, as well as how many people, including many religious people, have misunderstood their meaning and misapplied their guidance. One might criticize the book for repetitiveness, but that's not entirely Prager's fault. Biblical texts themselves are often quite repetitive. Even still, within his own commentary, Prager does repeat some of the same points multiple times. A few of these can be forgiven as repetition for the sake of emphasis, but in some cases I think he just added the same commentary to multiple verses simply because he had similar thoughts about each of those verses. If one wants to read this commentary as a reference book, just going one verse at a time and trying to understand, what does verse such and such mean, and checking his commentary, that's a good approach. That way the commentary is present at each verse whenever one might look it up. But if one wants to read it straight through, as I did, some of the repeated passages just felt extraneous. Nevertheless, I found this quite a useful book, and I'll be the first in line to get Prager's commentary on Leviticus whenever he finishes it and gets it released. Next up, I have one of my personal favorites of the bunch, and that is Bright City Shattered by Millie Abecassis. Now, of course, this is one I've released through my publishing house, Polymath Press. You can see right there. So even though I didn't write it, it would seem wrong for me to review it. It's not my book, but it's connected to my business. But because it is now available, having been released on June the 30th, it deserves its place in my review video. Obviously, I've read it many times, not just this month, but I tend to include the books that I'm publishing one time in my review videos, sometime around when they're released, and that's what I'm doing here. I already made a video just about this book on its own, so I'll refer you to that or to the Polymath Press website for more details and a full description of the book. But suffice it to say, this is a wonderful genre-bending book that combines a retro-futuristic science fiction setting with a delightful sort of whodunit mystery. While it's not technically a horror novel, it does, I think, explore a lot of the same intellectual ground the best of horror stories tend to explore, and so I think all you horror nerds out there are really going to like this one too. Okay, that's a lot of books. I do have just a few more to get through, but I wanted to take just a moment first to thank you for watching this, if you've gotten this far, for one thing. If you have, obviously you must, for whatever reason, like what I'm doing here, so I'd appreciate the thumbs up and the subscription if you wouldn't mind. Those kinds of things really do help me out a lot. And of course, just to remind you, now that you've seen some of the books that I'm talking about, there are links for purchase links for all of these books right down there in the What's It, which is another great way to support this channel and also to get some great reading material for yourself. All of that is, of course, very much appreciated. But getting back to business, we're not quite finished yet. We still have 3 more books to get through this month. And y'all know I like to throw an eclectic mix at you. And these are a perfect example of that, because while I am saving one more horror novel for the very last one, so we're going to end on our favorite genre, the next 2 might surprise some of you. The first of those is, of all things, an entire book dedicated to mint juleps. It's called The Kentucky Mint Julep, and it's by Joe Nickell. It says here, actually, Colonel Joe Nickell. He's an honorary Kentucky colonel. This author, Joe Nickell, is best known for his work in scientific skepticism. He's written about things like paranormal investigation, religious relics, miracles, that sort of thing. And in fact, that's how I first came across his work. As a horror fan, I love things like ghost stories and aliens and all of that kind of stuff. But also as a science nerd, I like to read about skeptical investigations into those kinds of things, and so his work is perfect for someone like me, and in fact, similar in many ways to the kinds of things that I'm doing with my Rocky Mountain Paranormal books. I have a personal fondness for my own, but Joe Nickell's are pretty good too. Never mind all that. This one is something entirely different. This is a short, tiny little book dedicated entirely to one of my favorite beverages. That sort of eclectic output is actually another reason why I find the author's work so delightful. On the one hand, he'll write scientific and historic skeptical works about aliens and religious relics and these kinds of things. And then on the other hand, he puts out an entire book about the mint julep. Wonderful. Though short, obviously, this book has enough time to devote about half of its length to a history of mint juleps, and the other half to various recipes for making your own. Though I do have my own recipe, which of course I insist is the only true and valid and correct one. But it was a lot of fun to see the various different twists and variations that others have put on the mint julep over the years, and perhaps my dignity could survive sampling some of the other recipes, even though mine is, of course, the best. But the best part of the book for me, rather than the recipes, although they were fun to read, was the short history of the drink in the first part of the book. I knew some of the story in broad strokes, but I actually learned a surprising amount for such a brief writing. And at the end of the day, it's not the kind of book that's probably ever going to be anyone's favorite unless you are a real devotee of the mint julep. But it's entirely charming. This is a wonderful little book, and it deserves a place of honor in any library's section on beverage making. That brings us to What is Mathematics? An Elementary Approach to Ideas and Methods by Richard Corrent and Herbert Robbins, with some additional writing and revisions by Ian Stewart. This has become something of a classic work in mathematics. No less a great mind than Einstein himself recommended it as an easily understandable overview of the entire field of mathematics. And it really is. It's a great book. It's a little bit dated in its approach, although a final chapter at the end concerning more recent developments does bring some of its content up to date that had fallen out of date since its original publication. But if you're looking for a single book to give you a taste of what mathematics is really all about, this would be one of my top few recommendations. It's important to understand what the subtitle means by an elementary approach, because this is not elementary in the sense that many people might think. This is not going to teach you things like basic arithmetic, which unfortunately is all many people seem to know of mathematics. It's not even going to teach you basic algebra. Indeed, its goal isn't really to teach you how to do mathematics of any sort. You can learn how to do some math, you can learn a lot from it, but what it really intends to teach you about is the breadth of mathematical ideas and methods, and to help you think like a mathematician. Its goal isn't to teach you everything there is to know about number theory, but to give you a taste of number theory and graph theory and all of these other disciplines, topology, all of these things. And in the context of serious mathematics, the kind of stuff that mathematicians do, this is fairly elementary. If you are a mathematician, you've probably seen most of the results that are described in this book. And in terms of how elementary it is, for the most part, it doesn't assume that you have a whole lot of advanced math. It does assume that you have mastered basic algebra. A couple of chapters will require you to know how to manipulate the trigonometric functions, but that's really just about it. That's all you need in order to be able to read and follow, I think, just about everything, if not everything, in the book. So you don't need to be a graduate level mathematician to understand this, but if you're a complete newbie who's looking to learn basic algebra, that's not what it means by elementary. But if you are a budding mathematician who wants to learn all of the various disciplines it covers, graph theory, topology, calculus, you name it, you are going to need to supplement your education with some other books. Its goal isn't to teach you how to do everything in calculus. Its goal is to show you some fascinating results in each field or in each subdiscipline, and to sort of give you a flavor of what each of those disciplines is all about, not to replace an entire undergraduate degree in mathematics. Think of this as a sort of tasting menu for math. I would, however, highly recommend this for anyone embarking on or considering a degree in mathematics. It won't tell you everything, but it'll give you a good taste of what you'll be doing in each of the courses that you would take in a degree in mathematics, and it will likely put you ahead of the curve in many or maybe even all of those courses. For everyone else not currently studying mathematics in a formal school setting, it remains a delightful sort of one-stop shop for anyone wondering about the kinds of things mathematicians spend their time thinking about. Again, assuming that you have basic algebra and a little bit of trig under your belt. That brings us, finally, back to our favorite genre, and I have a fairly new one to tell you about, called The Clatterman by Janelle Shaika. This is a delightful short novel that's very much a throwback to some of the classic horror we all know and love so much. The premise involves a group of friends who, sort of jokingly, perform a ritual thought to summon a vengeful spirit known as the Clatterman. Think of playing it summoning Bloody Mary at a slumber party by chanting into a mirror, and you're thinking along the right lines to understand what's going on in this novel. Of course, this being a horror novel, the summoning ritual works, and the group of friends find themselves being targeted by this powerful supernatural force. If that all sounds fairly familiar, you're not wrong. It's not the most original of plots, and it's not the most original of novels. Indeed, it seems to draw fairly heavy inspiration from Candyman in particular, but neither is it just a retelling of classic stories or a ripoff of older works. Think of it instead as an original novel that intentionally harkens back to the kind of horror we all loved back in the day. Think of it, in fact, as a sort of love letter to the genre and to those classic works in the genre. The character of the Clatterman himself is a wonderful creation. The author has drawn from both folklore and prior works of horror to create a character who feels familiar enough to be sort of right at home in the horror pantheon, but remains original enough that the reader is never quite sure exactly what's coming next. And he comes complete with his own summoning ritual that does feel a lot like the summoning of Candyman or Bloody Mary or something like that, but with original twists on it and sort of turned up to 11. This one is going to truly delight a lot of horror fans, especially those of us with a particular fondness for 1980s horror. And just as a side note, if any of y'all want to see me try the Clatterman summoning ritual myself, just for the fun of it, let me know down in the comments. Maybe I'll do it. Perhaps I'll try to summon several of those folklorish spirits all at once one of these days. I could do Clatterman, I could do Bloody Mary, I could do a bunch of them. I don't know. Seems like a good idea. Might be fun. Could go horribly wrong, but, you know, that's the way the horror genre is. But anyway, that brings us to the end, alas, of another mass review video. My apologies for making this one lighter than usual on the horror genre. I actually almost had at least one more horror novel for this month, but at the end of June, things just got crazy busy with lots of work, so I just didn't quite make it. I had one in progress, but I just didn't quite finish by the end of the month. A lot of my attention was devoted, of course, to the Bright City Shattered release, because it did come out right at the end of June. So, you know, check that one out, of course. And I was also busy preparing for a big convention coming up at the beginning of July called Fan Expo in Denver. And by the way, if you happen to see this before the 4th of July weekend and happen to be in Denver or the Denver area for that weekend, stop by the con and say hello. But putting all that aside, the point was I was just really busy at the end of the month, didn't read those last couple of horror novels that I had planned, but that just means we'll be able to start off the July review video with some wonderful horror novels, so be sure to stay tuned for that. But all that being said, it's time for me to sign off, so go read some great horror novels, or your own eclectic mix of horror and other books. And of course, as always, take care and stay scared.